I think.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to ISO Chats. My name is Tamara Young. I'm at the University of Newcastle. I'm the co-convener of ISO Chats with Anne Hardy at the University of Tasmania, and I also want to thank the rest of our ISO Chats dream team, Effie and Oscar. We begin ISO Chats by acknowledging country. Australia is and always has been Aboriginal land. We have participants here from all across Australia, and so we acknowledge the lands upon which everyone is based. Specifically, we acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands upon which we live, to the Awabakal people of Newcastle, where I live and work, and to the Muwinina people of the Hobart region, where Anne is based at the University of Tasmania. We pay our respects to Aboriginal elders past, present and emerging, and recognise continuing connection to lands, waters and cultures. So welcome to chapter 5 of season 4 of ISO Chats, and we'll introduce our wonderful speaker Aaron Tham in just a few moments. A little introduction from me. I think I read yesterday that approximately 20 million Australians are currently in lockdown. Or maybe I've exaggerated that, but I know it's over 50% of our population. When Anne and I came up with the idea for ISO Chats in April of last year, we certainly had no idea that we would still be in lockdown in the middle of 2021, that this global pandemic would mean that international travel for networking and for collaboration in academia would be so far out of our reach. We did not also expect to have such amazing and ongoing support for the ISO Chats initiatives from all of our tourism colleagues across the world, and we want to thank you wholeheartedly. And also we want to acknowledge and thank the Council for Australasian Tourism and Hospitality and Events Education, also known as CALTHE, for endorsing us as a network promoting research excellence. If you are interested in watching any of the other seasons of ISO Chats, you can go and binge from season 1 through to season 3, and we are now uploading season 4 to the CALTHE webpage as well. A little bit of ISO Chats etiquette. I think the main thing I'd really want to say here is, if you are planning to use any of the ideas that are presented in ISO Chats as part of your research or teaching, please ensure that you cite it accordingly, and also feel free to let the speaker know that you're using their ISO Chats within their syllabus, because that's really important for them to understand how their research may be being used. We're recording the seminar. We will upload it to Facebook and to the CALTHE website. We would love you to keep your cameras on so that the speaker can see your beautiful faces, but please mute your microphones. Pop your questions into the chat function and I will moderate them as best I can at the end of the presentation. And I will now hand over to Anne to introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much, Tamara, and thanks everyone for coming along. Before I introduce Aaron, I'd just like to make a little plug for our next ISO Chats. I've completely lost count of what chapter we're up to. I think this is 7, but maybe it's 6, but whatever. We're very excited because the next ISO Chat will actually be led by one of our dream team, Effie Stereopoulos, and she's going to be talking about transformative events. We'll get the title a little bit more fancy for you, and we'll also fix up the time zone because it says GMT +11, not 10. But yeah, please mark that in your calendar, and we'll advertise that through Facebook and on Twitter as well.
Who is she?
For now, sorry, what did you say, Effie?
Who is she?
Who is she? Who is she? An up-and-coming superstar. That's who she is. But today we actually are hosting another superstar, and that is Aaron Tham. And it's my pleasure to introduce Aaron. Aaron is the program coordinator of the Tourism, Leisure and Events major at the University of Sunshine Coast in Australia. He's had publications in a variety of different journals, and his main areas that he concentrates on are emerging technologies and also the legacy of events, which is a nice segue into Effie's work. But today, Aaron is going to be talking about social media. Aaron is a fellow of the Higher Education Academy, and he's been involved in organising and chairing several tourism related conferences in the Asia Pacific region as part of his portfolio as the immediate past Vice President and Conference Chair of the Travel and Tourism Research Association, TTRA, Asia Pacific chapter. Aaron was born and raised in Singapore, and he did his first degree at Nanyang Technological University in marketing. He then went into international tourism at Griffith University before he went back to work in Singapore on projects such as the Formula One and the opening of two integrated resorts, Marina Bay Sands and also Resorts World. He got his PhD from Monash University in the area that he's talking about today, social media. And he also, in his PhD, looked at social media and destination choice. He has been appointed as an adjunct teaching fellow and visiting scholar to several countries, including Malaysia, Vietnam, Canada, Taiwan, and Japan. Aaron continues to have a strong relationship working with the tourism industry and works with tourism operators in sectors such as medical tourism, airline culture, coffee and tea tourism, craft beer tourism, and he's also importantly part of the working committee for the proposed Brisbane Olympic bid. So thank you very much, Aaron. It's really my pleasure to introduce you today and to have you speak. So I'll let you take the floor.
Thank you, and Tamara, Iffy, and Oscar for giving me the opportunity to speak. It's on a rare occasion on Fridays that I could make it, so I put my hands up for this edition. Every other Friday going into November, I'm actually teaching on Fridays. So this is a timely one, especially for us. Looking at the notion of distance socializing, where we are, and acknowledging that many of us in the room here are also experiencing lockdowns of various forms. Let me share my slides. I'll start with acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land on which we meet. I'm now in Brisbane, and we are in Turrbal country land, where we also see the past president emerging leaders and looking at where we can actually partner them. Is an important year for Queensland. It is the year of Indigenous tourism as well. And so we're starting to see how we can actually support them through a range of initiatives too. Some of the things that we'll be discussing, looking at social media and the different forms, methods, practices, and sometimes learning from our own mistakes or idiosyncrasies as well. But my idea is to open up a conversation for collaboration among some of the interested participants in the room and looking at where that might go from here. A bit about myself, as mentioned by Anne, was born and raised in Singapore the last 11 years now, and counting, have been in the country here. Lived in Melbourne for 4 years, in Queensland now for 7 years, and work and holidaying has taken me around. I had the privilege to see Anne about 2 weeks ago in Kansing in Tasmania. Little did I realize that so much has changed since then in the landscape. I'll start with a bit of a broad overview of where social media is and what the data looks like. So when we're looking at essentially social media, the two words put together, is a platform where we disseminate user-generated content, hence the words social. And it's a very mediatized space. Some of the icons more familiar to us, others may be less familiar, depending on which part of the world you are in. Some platforms tend to be country-centric, so like in China with WeChat and so on. In Korea, there is Signet, and there's many others that have a similar country domain. Others like Facebook obviously have a wider strip in terms of where they go in their applications across numerous countries and platforms. When we look at data sets as well, and the literature and research just tell us that there's a whole range of things that we can gather. So I'm just showing you two common ones. You've got Instagram, that are sites where you could see people post pictures, images, maybe even videos now, and you can have live feeds as you move forward with new iterations of the app. The other one is an interesting one. There are forums left, right, center now on things like the COVID vaccine, disease, what it's like, and so on, and the different forums and where people post replies on threads. And you could see that across tourism forums on websites like TripAdvisor for other examples as well. The question then is, well, why do we actually want to get involved, or why does social media offer some form of benefit in terms of data and research analysis? It tends to have large or at times fairly big amounts of data that contain usually rich aspects about a destination, people, consumer behavior, sentiments, and this could be generally unmoderated unless they turn to become more abusive, um, on the verge of sometimes slander and so on. Then they get taken off by administrators and moderators. But you get a sense of how people are responding or reacting to different aspects. So it is a fascinating space as we talk in terms of the pandemic, the ethos of things like vaccine passports, for example. You've got a whole flurry of people supporting it, against it, and asking questions around the ethics and morality around it. Generally speaking, social media content is free until we come to the platforms or software required to analyze the data. It can be quick to collect and compile with the appropriate software. So NVivo, for example, has got version 10 and above, looking at drawing together certain hashtags or contents that you set the parameters around. It could, and I raised a question there, depending on the project, reduce the complex ethical application processes associated with your institutions or judiciaries where the contents are published in the public domain. And as we speak, well, we are aware as well that different countries, institutions may have rewritten their social media research guidelines or ethics as they deal with these contents for research and other engagement purposes. Nevertheless, the text, images, and videos offer us very unique perspectives about a phenomenon from a gender, age group, country, cross-cultural perspective. So that might be of interest to some of you in the work that you do. When we have that data set as a possible source, there are other methodological considerations that we need to, I guess, reflect on, even as we go down this dark zone of social media, because you could get into really deep rabbit holes here and ask ourselves, well, what exactly do we want to locate? And the key question here is one, where we sit in terms of our research epistemologies. Many research projects have been data driven, where they looked at social media analytics, likes, responses, and so on. So it's very hard science related. You can also have constructive type of epistemologies or frameworks and research questions that guide your forays into social media. But we also then draw based on our philosophies and our frameworks, and I'll talk about that in the next couple of slides, where the dominant theories exist, asking ourselves which social media platform, or for that better rigor, if you like, looking at triangulation, looking at two or different types of platforms, word versus images versus videos, for example. Are there tools that are available in your institution or your sphere of influence where you could use to analyze the contents? I am aware as well that there are industry and also software developers with certain platforms that could be used in a very robust way to analyze the content. How long should I collect the data? Well, we normally set some parameters. You could actually draw a line in the sand to say, I'm going to start from the start of the pandemic till now and see what happens to tourism behavior. What ways would I present the data? And this is often one that, depending on the journal, research output, report that you're writing, you might want to decide how best to represent them into images, quotes, tables, charts, supplementary data folders, annex, and so on. More importantly, I think many of us in the room here may not have the full set of answers around social media and its applications. And I do encourage, even for myself, to approach others who might need the kind of data sets or skill sets, and give that opportunity to appear, who may be a better versed person to look at things like programming or data analytics. One of the tools that I've used in the past and also might be new to some of you is this platform called Netlytic, for a, I guess, trial or early forays into it. It allows us to actually analyze things like hashtags and ad handles with Twitter. So this is a platform developed, I do believe, out of Ryerson University in Canada, and I had the opportunity to meet them way back in 2018 when travel was still permitted. and to see how they went about developing the software and getting a bit of a feel for what the conversations and how you actually can analyze that content. So you can just sign up quite easily with a Google account or Yahoo or an email password. We also look at tools, and you often hear this where the term netnography comes about, where we kind of immerse ourselves on the internet, hence the word netnography. There are certain steps involved in there. This book, in the latest edition, written by Kozinets, tells us the kind of steps that are in there and the way we can adopt our stance from what often we see as lurker stances, Lurker, observing content at a distance and not, I guess, manipulating the discussions in any way possible and just observing what happens in there, to very active, robust type of engagements where you actually declare, I am so and so looking at this topic, and I would like to get a sense of your interpretations about, for instance, drones or colors of ice cream, for example. And you could actually see how that might be a way that you then interpret the data, but also reflecting on that positionality, which is a quite an important area here, knowing where the ethics and the boundaries lie and how close you are both to the content and to the participants on that particular platform. There's some social media theories that tend to be adopted across different levels of both research, engagement, and books. The one on the left is what we term the users and gratifications theory, why people use social media as a result of the pleasure or hedonic practices that they gain out of the concepts and the platforms for entertainment purposes. And then on the right hand side, you also see how some of these past experience through technology adoption, familiarity with the platform, cultural background, and social factors influences the outcome based on the social media portals or the engagements through the experience that we've got. So there are a range of theories that are available, and I do encourage you to explore more in terms of drawing from wider disciplines when this is the case. Pan and Krotz, in their book chapter in 2012, looked at the way we can actually approach social media analysis for tourism, hospitality, events, and so on, looking at different transdisciplinary contexts. You've got this thing of social exchange theory, where participation is based on value propositions and how, through, I guess, that give and take, favorable, positive outcomes, people tend to be more disposed to certain platforms than others, and others that may perhaps fall by the wayside due to the lack of returns or the lack of benefits that they perceive from being involved in a particular forum. There are also different types of consumer behavior ones that you see on the right, where the stage of purchase, or what we call the IDA model of communication awareness, and where that brand or conscious top of mind decisions comes to be. And you could actually apply a range of media theories here as well, depending on your project and whether it's relevant or not. So there is not just one way to engage in social media. You could do one in one particular aspect for a project, and you can then evolve into something else for another project on your end. Ethics, and I'm probably in a position to share some of my ethics experiences when looking at social media as a start. Looking at the start of my PhD, when I started in 2010, my supervisor Glenn is here, we were aware that in many institutions, social media ethics committees were very new to it, but now they get a bit of a nuance around how projects are, whether they're public or not, whether you deal with a certain level of anonymity or whether you deal with young children or vulnerable communities. There's a lot more now that is being observed. There is a tightening of what information is public versus what appears not to be as public or for research purposes. But more importantly, as we traverse across different continents and institutions, there are significant variations in many Asian or African or Latin American countries that I'm aware of. There's sometimes very little that governs the social sciences in terms of research projects like this. And it is therefore the onus or our responsibility to then put this into our application and ensure that the rights and the responsibilities are accordingly held and upheld to respect the privacy and the goodwill across different countries as we look at these levels of cross-country collaborations, for example. It can be challenging. Recruitment of participants, what does implied consent look like, how we store the data, translation and interpretation, especially so in my last point on this slide, where some participants may delve into fairly deviant behavior, things like weapons or drugs or some form of illegal activity that we, in some countries or jurisdictions, are permitted, but in many others may be frowned upon. And so we just have to be aware of some of these intricacies when you're dealing with social media. And it can take a long time. My drone project looking at social media was sitting in ethics for close to almost 9 months. Eventually got over the line, and on the caveat that I wore a motorcycle helmet in the field, observing some of these people other than the social media data. And obviously, then people were saying that I look like the steak from Top Gear or something, which was quite funny given that it was in the heat of a almost 36-degree Brisbane day where I was wearing that motorcycle helmet. Some of the projects that I wanted to briefly touch upon in terms of how I engage with social media content across different aspects. So one recent one that I was involved with and invited to be on and the associate editor of this journal now is looking at the theme park disasters and social media sentiments. So what I had done was to look at the Dreamworld disaster, and I looked at what happened on the day of the incident for a week. You can extend that to a month and so on. You can actually track using the Athletic what topics were viral, what were the keywords being searched, where were they going into the mainstream, who were the influencers, and so on. So you could actually do quite a fair bit of work in a very short span of time. The beauty of the Netlytic framework is also shows you who writes to whom. The broader, the thicker the line, the darker the coloration, or the dot suggests he or she in a position where they actually send out more information, and that text or that particular Twitter feed was actually shared across to different domains and different parts of the world. And you can actually see how this becomes quite a powerful tool when operators, for example, know who are sharing their word, how much influence they yield, and therefore having that conversations with certain participants of whether there's a way to actually move this forward. And in a time like a crisis or a disaster, that's actually quite a powerful tool. You can also, in the realm of social media, let the data develop theory and practice. And through my supervisors, Glenn is here, and Judith as well, looking at how some of the early research can actually be used to develop certain theories, particularly in our paper that we published in Tourism Recreation Research 2 years ago. We looked at the notion of context. We looked at this notion of influence in destination decision making, and we actually developed a three-dimensional prism where we look at three domains: planning complexity, social media engagement, and destination familiarity, to be the tenets and the building blocks where you could actually position people across different aspects of some of these contexts. Quite interestingly, end of last year, a response has come through again where there was quite a long, detailed critique of this particular paper, looking at what we did well, what we didn't do well, and I thought it was quite interesting that people were dissecting the paper to that extent. I also partnered with my co-author from the IT department at my institution a few years ago, where we were looking at deviant behavior through trolling. And trolling in this token relates to people who attack others and are a bit more antagonistic towards comments and people for a whole range of reasons, sometimes no fault of their own. So he was able to develop a Python program to collate some of the information we needed on the Lonely Planet Thorn Tree forum site. And we could actually categorize this information accordingly based on the number of trolling instances, how they could be categorized. You actually count them and you have codes accordingly for it. And this could be conducted over a period of 1 to 5 years. I tried to get him to explain to me coding and Python programming in about 10 minutes. I gave up after 2 minutes because obviously it's outside my sphere of research and practice. But increasingly now I'm delving a bit more into some of these colleagues who are from different backgrounds, because they offer a rich sense of how we equip ourselves from media theory perspective, from multimodality, which is a new word I'm starting to read a bit more about, and how we analyze things like pictures or videos and other non-textual information. It's a fascinating world of visual methods. Other papers that I've looked at in terms of social media, and you don't have to be just fixated with just one data set. You could actually look at mixed methods. So the one on the left with leisure etiquette and drones, which was my Top Gear example. I looked at social media content on Facebook drone sites and how they negotiated leisure etiquette in the area of drones, and also interview people and watch them as they flew their drones in Brisbane and in Singapore. So you could actually mix social media with in-person interviews, focus group surveys, if that is of interest to you as a bit of a mixed method study. You can also have what we call multiple data sets, as I mentioned earlier, where in the paper on the right, I was looking at the concept of loom bands, which were quite popular about 2 or 3 years ago. And this actually was sparked by an idea when I was looking at my daughter play loom bands. And I said, well, hold on a minute, there's a bit of a leisure and entrepreneurship in there as well. So I managed to get ethics approval to do this, to look at the loom bands from YouTube channels and also from different forums as well. So you could actually see how this might be, I guess, a sense of where you could corroborate your findings through either different methods or different data sets. Where do we see some of these trends move into the future? There will be increasing interest and, I guess, more adoption of things like visual method analysis. So as I mentioned before, as they become more sophisticated with the techniques, things like semiotics of photos and videos becomes a fascinating world. So I'm starting on a project with another colleague of mine to look at TikTok content, which is interesting because it's only about 60 seconds or less, and how we actually code or what do we look for in some of that data. The opportunities for cross-cultural studies, what is written in English versus other languages on social media, and the translation or the sentiments that arise from it. Longitudinal investigations will be also of interest. So things like what happens over the period of the pandemic, or the bushfires, for example, and what we perceive to be crisis versus what other stakeholders might deem to be the real crisis. There will probably also be a greater suite of affordable, well, hopefully, I'm hoping for, and mainstream software to assist us with the different ways to analyze and social media contents, and more importantly, to also train us as researchers, because many of us, as we've seen in the room, were probably brought up in a world of business schools, and this doesn't necessarily become part of our training mechanisms or courses that we are exposed to. So it is useful to actually have that conversation. I think I'm in I guess, a more favorable space now with this year merge the School of Business with the School of Creative Industry. So people who are with the journalistic flair, people who are the content creators, music producers, and other video designers are able to then chime in where we see some areas for collaboration. But the gap that I noted, and I think would be something that would be quite courageous and important to undertake, is this development of methodological papers, the how-to of getting social media done, and what does that method involve, looking at not just the time and the money, but also the techniques involved with this. It's not common to have a social media methodology paper, but I guess the time is right when many of us now do our distance socializing over the next, I don't know how long, with the pandemic and the different iterations of the virus and its variants. So quite quickly to conclude, it does offer us as a platform to look at interdisciplinary studies, consumer behavior, online communities, and therefore to pursue different topics for mixed methods and analysis. There are also hashtags and many other topics clearly that would be of interest to us. I've put up a couple of the hashtags here, but you could probably see as well, I think, for myself and a few others, the upcoming announcement of whether or not Brisbane gets to host the Brisbane Olympics will be of interest as well. So we'll be watching this space quite closely as to what potential data sets we could actually also access and conduct similar research topics. And that is that. I will stop sharing my screen, come back to the group. I try and keep my presentation short. One of my more experienced peers has tried to teach me the way Netflix works and how we could do the Netflix of teaching into bite-sized and episodes. It's a bit more time-consuming to think of what you want to put in, but I think the gist of it is presentation should be no longer than 22.5 minutes. I don't know where that number came from, but it was quite interesting for someone who was trying to explain to me teaching and research. So here is the rest of the time open to question, comments. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Aaron. It's interesting, isn't it? I'm going to go with the 22.5 minutes because you covered so much information in that short period of time. And I remember back, years ago when we were teaching students, it was that they could concentrate for whatever it was, 32 minutes. And now it's shorter amount of time. No one has posted any questions yet, but I will. Anne's waving her hand, but I do have a question. And because she's on mute, I'm going to start. I'm interested, I guess, in the ethical question, and you did have the question mark after the ethics, because I think, I know that when we started with ethnographic research, in the past decade, there was that idea that carrying out desktop research on using social media sites could avoid potentially going through the ethics application procedures, but I believe that's changed. Do you have any further insight into that, please?
So when I approach our ethics committee, which is a very conservative committee, I must say,
Yes,
I actually requested that for certain topics like social media, we actually do a bit of a viva. So we zoom in to the ethics meetings at a time where you're given like 5 or 6 minutes to actually present the topic, and then they get a bit of a better appreciation of what you're doing. So then they can make an informed decision on whether this is low or high risk. So that was the first thing that we kind of asked of them. It's not common. I probably do this maybe once, maybe at the most was 3 times back in 2018, where they just wanted a bit of clarity around it. It also depends on where and who is involved with the ethnography. I had a question that they took about 3.5 months to get back to me, and I said, what if I'm analyzing myself on social media? And they struggle because I'm like, well, I'm putting up the application, I am the one signing the consent form, and I am the one reading the transcripts, and it's only me. So what ethics is there that I need to sign off? So that opened up a whole raft of discussion, because other people in autoethnography, collaborative ethnography started to ask those questions. And so we now have some guidelines on observational studies online. And there's a series of 10 questions, like a checklist, where you just have to circle them, and then they will come back to you if they need more information.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you. And I like the idea of being able to just explain to the ethics committee the nature of the research and data collection. Okay, if I will pass over to Anne for her question, and anyone else, if you want to pop up your hand, I will moderate those questions for you. Anne.
Great, thanks, Mara. Thanks, Aaron. That was a great presentation. I really enjoyed it. And my question is also a little bit around ethics, because, when we first started, we could get our computer dudes to write Python scripts and scrape the data. And now the companies have got, really strict, we can't do that, which makes it really hard, doesn't it? And we also have lots of problems with the ethics committee. But I was wondering, with the program that you use, I forget the name. Netlytics, yeah. Does that actually, so can you sort of set it so you say only, because UTAS, for example, we're only allowed to, unless you're doing like an ethnography thing where you're actually revealing yourself, you can really only analyze posts that are public or have very overt hashtags where you can see the user is trying to increase the visibility of their post. So with that program, can you actually set it so that it only looks at those types of posts, or how does it work?
So on Netlytic, what you do is after you've logged in, for the trial version that I have, I believe I'm only given up to 4 data sets that I can use at any one time. And what I then do is I set up like a hashtag. So if I hashtag like a Me Too or hashtag COVID-19, then they will ask you, when do you want to start collecting the data from? And it gets to about 400. I'm not sure if you need further licenses for it. It gets to about a certain limit, and then they'll ask you, well, you've exhausted your trial license. Do you want to keep going? And if you do, then there's extra license that you actually have to pay for.
Yeah.
But most of my projects so far haven't actually gone past that threshold yet. They might have changed over the last 6 months because a lot of people were online and doing that kind of research. And they are, Netlytics is just one of the many tools in the market. I know here in Australia, you've got Social Baker, Social Norm. There's a whole range of platforms now that are developing what they call as data analytics to help you in your project.
So does it actually like write a script and because like Facebook, Instagram,
Mm,
those ones have all banned
yeah.
automated scraping. So how does it get around that?
Well, with Twitter, because the API is still open,
Oh,
so they
right.
can
Yep.
actually
Yep.
tap
Yep.
that. So
Yep.
with
Yep.
Facebook, Instagram's a bit harder now to
Yeah.
actually do that. So my example on TikTok that I'm looking at now, I have the data set, but it's a long-standing process to go and watch the video, code
Yeah.
it, annotate it, and so on, because it's just there's no shortcut to it. I've actually asked about 7 different developers, both here and overseas. I said, how do you analyze TikTok? And they're like, oh, good luck. So so
Yeah.
so I
No.
had to do it manually.
There's definitely a methods book in there. But thanks, Aaron. Sorry, I've asked enough questions.
That's
I'll
all right.
be quiet now. Thank you. It's great.
Cliff has posted a question. Cliff, do you want to ask your question to Aaron, please?
Sure. Hopefully you can't hear the storm rolling outside. Looks like the end of days here. But thank you, Aaron. That was a great presentation. And I think what I was curious about is the role of bots and how you account for it and manage it. Because we did some work on in the environmental emission stuff recently. And what we found was the bots were very polarizing in the opinion about well, basically it was talking about how India and China as developing nations are the problem. And when we looked at some of those comments, there was a clear trend. Like, how have you sort of accommodated for bots in the work you do?
Yeah, my understanding, Cliff, is that you look at bots in the area of AI and how it automates certain responses through the algorithm of machine learning into forums and such. So, for example, one of our student projects looking at the user-generated content and the bot response, we did a project with Air New Zealand on Oscar, the chatbot, and how that actually then changes the way we actually talk or feel about the topic. So with the Oscar chatbot and user-generated content, like you say, it's very mechanized. So they actually will tell you, like, if you have a luggage or excess baggage, this is what you do. And we actually have to pull that separately to how we would respond. And that's an understudied area, Cliff, if that's something that you're interested in, the way that the AI takes that role in an increasing space in tourism and hospitality to deal with the mundane and repetitive information, to give us the response in a fraction of a millisecond. It doesn't necessarily build in that emotional connection. So you can't ask a chatbot, how are you? They just ask you what is your question to get to the point. So they are very, I guess, solution driven, not necessarily how we understand the origins of Facebook and so on, to be more socially driven. So I think we got to differentiate or dissect the two, leave the machine learning ones as one component, and then look at, even if you like, I think there's some papers coming out in the US where they look at the bots response versus people on calls and comparing which ones give the receiver more of a satisfaction or care or some of the service quality elements.
Fantastic. Thanks, Aaron. That's definitely an area for lots of conversation and investigation. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Cliff and Aaron. Madura, would you like to ask your question? Pop your microphone on, or I can ask it for you. I can't see you. Madura. Oh, okay. I'll go ahead. How do we avoid being biased when selecting social media data inputs, as we have to select the source? This is Madura from Sri Lanka. So how do we avoid that bias?
Well, first of all, I guess it's depending on your research framework and the parameters that you set yourself for. So if you have a timeline from say 1st of January to 31st of December, that's the parameter that you're working with for longitudinal data, for instance.
Mm.
However, the source becomes problematic when people post under John Doe or Mary Jane and you do not have an idea whether he or she is actually who they claim to be. The other challenge that I am very conscious now is that there are also regional or continental jurisdictions on the use of data. So, for instance, in Europe, you've got the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, that kicks in. So, you can't actually use content for people in the EU so easily without giving their approval on their social media platforms. So, I have to often check my data set and say, well, does this person actually give consent to me using it? I will post sometimes on the social media channels. My name is Aaron and I'm doing a project on this. If you would like to be excluded from this project, please let me know. And then I'll get a list of people who ask to be excluded and I have to exclude them even though some of them are fascinating or interesting, but I had to exclude them. One of my projects, I had to exclude it almost just before the paper got published because the person actually died and I didn't know. So
Mm.
when I followed up, and then it was, I think, a caregiver in the household that said, unfortunately, this person had died about 4 months ago. So I actually could not use that data. I had to actually delete all that data set. So it is a moving beast. It can be there today, so you could see what people posted today. You could get a screenshot of it, of the date and timestamp, but tomorrow it could no longer be there. People could actually remove that feed. So you have to
Mm.
be mindful of some of these challenges as well in terms of that. The other question about bias is if you're working in a team, the coding or what we call the continuous comparison method can actually help overcome that bias in terms of how we've seen the data, how our lens looks at that content, and asking ourselves if the code would be a similar coding principle or mechanism that the other person is looking at this data.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else want to pop their hand up for a question? We have another 10 or so minutes, so I think we should make the most of the time we have with Aaron and his expertise here in using social media data for our research, because I know that many of us in the room are currently doing so. Anyone want to pop their hands up?
I've got another one, but if there's no one else, but I'm just looking around the room to see if anyone else has got one before I
Not
jump
at the
in.
moment.
Okay. Aaron, can you tell us about the TikTok project? Because I'm intrigued.
So
It's the second
Cool.
TikTok project that I've heard about today, so I'm
Oh,
intrigued as
really?
well.
Yeah,
Yep.
I want to know and how you plan to analyze it. It sounds
Mm.
fascinating.
So, because of its growth and its use and adoption by various destination marketing organizations around the world, we were quite fascinated as to to what extent is TikTok different to the other prior social media platforms. One, in terms of influencer marketing, and whether or not these influencers versus the usual generated content by users with the hashtag of destination had certain semiotical differences. So we have the data set with TikTok, and I've had the data set since October last year from a range of DMOs on their TikTok channels.
Mm.
And then we got stuck because we had no idea how to analyze that data. I was like, I'm watching TikTok videos like day in, day out. And I'm like, how in the world do I analyze this? So I had to reach out to different people. What do I look out for? The genre, the semiotics, the text. And now working with people in different continents, they can analyze the post in their native language, like in Arabic in Dubai, for example, or Chinese in China, and so on. And that allows us to then draw on that information. So we're quite, I guess, early days in terms of getting this analysis up and running. We just put the research questions in there, looking at cross-cultural similarities or differences, but it's fascinating. I am conscious and on your question about ethics, because some of these TikTok users or posters appear to be very young. And I'm like, I can't tell if that person is a youth or a child or not.
Mm.
So I went to my institution and I said, this is the TikTok project. This is what I'm doing. It's public domain because it's just hashtagging the destination. What ethics do I need? And 3 days later, they came back, you have an ethics waiver. And I'm like, oh, that's unreal. That is unreal. I've never had a faster ethics waiver in my life.
That would be
So
maximum risk for us at UTAS. That would be through the committee.
I
That would
was,
be like
yeah, I
intense.
was expecting the same, revise
Mm,
and do it
mm,
again, but they gave me a waiver, and I thought the justification was that it's used by the destination. People are watching the videos without knowing the true identity of the person, so they were quite happy for me to go ahead and do what I do. Um, how I present the data will be interesting because obviously I can't expect reviewer two to see like 65 or 300 videos, which would be unreal. So
mm.
we have to think about how we go and put that information there. But I mean, there's a lot of interesting ones about TikTok and the memes that have been developed over this.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic work, and there's definitely a methods book for you there, Aaron, or at least a chapter.
Definitely. I have a question. Sorry, I have to keep leaning over to see my other screen. If anyone else doesn't have their hands up at the moment, I don't want to. In the papers that you've published, Aaron, you've mentioned various different forms of social media, TikTok and Facebook. Have you ever done any research on TripAdvisor? And I'm wondering, if so, how do you feel about the reliability of the reviews that we read on sites such as TripAdvisor or Airbnb, for example? What's that sort of reliability question?
Well, I think as with any social media site, you're going to have fake reviews and fake IDs on that portal or channel, and you can only make the most out of certain criterion. So with TripAdvisor reviews, for example, we're doing now looking at different cultural ways that they are writing about the particular review. And then you could actually see from reviewer or this person posting it that there seems to be some inconsistencies. So how can he or she be in Madrid on the same day that they're posting about a review on Bangkok? Doesn't
Yeah.
make sense. So you start to actually question the reliability of that data. A lot of it has been written about the credibility, and I acknowledge some people in the room here would probably also have their own rubrics and way of checking for reliability. But by and large, uh, at face value, looking at the volume of information that we're dealing, many people are quite happy what they call a error rate of 3%, and they would still say that it's still fairly authentic. 97% of people are generally writing about their own experiences.
Out of interest, have you published on that topic of reliability, or can you direct me to someone who has?
Yeah, so I'll put it in the chat. Julian, a friend of mine, he joined the University of Coventry in the UK. He was in the UAE for 5 or 6 years and is now back in the UK.
Yep.
So he does quite a fair bit of work on credibility, authenticity of posts, like on TripAdvisor.
Yeah. Okay. That'd be fantastic if you could send me a couple of links. I'd be really interested.
Sure.
While we're here, a couple of other people are putting in Madura again. In Sri Lanka, booking.com discussion communities are more active to attract the potential tourists and to find more suitable traveling options. I don't know if that's in response to my comment about TripAdvisor. And then Effie has said that she tried to give a review about her hotel experience in New York, but TripAdvisor refused to publish it because she was negative.
I think that Effie as well, that I think there was a news report of a young man who was trying to defend his mom with a negative review, and he's now facing a lawsuit on the back of a negative review of a 2-star rating. And I said this is going down a very dangerous path and precedence, where if you're giving an honest review with evidence like receipts or service levels and so on, that if the bigger businesses with deep pockets are able to, I guess, manipulate or change the way the website only features the favorable reviews, then we're setting ourselves up for really challenging times with things like social media.
So if I was to talk about my reliability and TripAdvisor, I've had another case when I tried to get a review about the Marriott in Boston, and then they came back, sorry to hear about that. I would say from personal experience, I would give like 60 or 70% credibility factor. So maybe if you're not familiar with how TripAdvisor works, have a profile, be in it for a little while, and then use your own experience for the reliability factor. But I don't know if there's a paper published on that.
TripAdvisor is similar now to Airbnb, where you have this notion of a superhost or like a batch or a star reviewer or something. So the more reviews you do, they can verify it. I've been seeing some other sites now where they actually expect you to show proof of a receipt or an invoice as part of your stay. And I think that's the only thing that you can do to actually verify that the person is a bona fide guest or customer in your restaurant or cruise or hotel, for example. And then that then allows, like to what Tamara was saying, this notion of credibility, because like you say, anyone could actually write anything about the experience without necessarily knowing that this is true or not.
I also had an industry contact overseas to say, can you do a review for me, please, on TripAdvisor? And then I thought about it and I thought, actually, I will, because at least I did have the experience. I was happy to do the positive review, but.
I'm looking at the chat and Madhura's asking, were you able to study the informal sector with social media, which is a threat to formal establishments? There are increasingly some of these, I guess, I'm not sure if Madhura is referring to what we call the gig economy, but there is an increasing number of papers now looking at the data set from Airtasker. So how people actually need a house clean or car wash or something, or some form of walking the dog or something, and reviewing that from the informal sector basis. So there might be many other ones that you would have seen. I know in Asia, Uber and Uber Eats and many of the other food delivery type of platforms themselves also have their relevant review portals, for example.
I have an interesting one, Aaron. I'm doing a research on attention restoration at airports. And these are sort of side, like I collect qualitative data and you get some side comments. So one of them was on bots. So when you talk to airport managers, they were very positive about, hey, bots, they've solved so many problems for us. And I think it was mostly from the cost side of things and like replacing humans with technology. But from the customer side of things, like you mentioned Air New Zealand, now I'm not sure, there's a robot as well that Air New Zealand has in the Sydney lounge. And you sometimes wonder, because there's a human there as well that says, here, give me your boarding pass and I'll scan it and the robot will tell you where to go. And it was interesting because when I asked them, I said, look, I asked the consumers, how do you look at that robotic experience? And they don't like it because they go, oh, A, it's too human. But then like from a ticking the box perspective, look, we had so many users use the services of this person, but the services was enabled or guided by a human to say, take your boarding pass and show it to this person. So I think there's also another research, I've scratched the surface. So there's another research area that's quite ripe, I think, to see, like there's from the provider perspective and from the user perspective, and how sometimes the two KPIs don't probably line up. I don't know. It's just a thought that came up.
Yeah, and you're right, Paresh. Interesting you mentioned it. I'm meeting a restaurateur who's just got his robots in his restaurant here in Brisbane and further up along the sunny coast. And he's trying to put in tracking devices on these robots. So while they're serving you food, they're actually trying to pick up the conversations of comments about the robot. So user-generated voice recognition comments about the robot, like, oh, look at this, it's so cool, it's fast, it's courteous, it's consistent in the service. And I was fascinated, like, do the customers actually know that the comments that people are talking about the robot are actually being recorded? Was my point. And I'll see him, I think next week or the week after, because he's might still be in Melbourne or something. And that's my, I was just intrigued, like what you say, as they start to deploy more of these bots into the service environment.
Yeah,
that's fascinating. Thank you so much for your talk today. It's right on 1 o'clock. I'll say thank you and a big virtual clap from myself and everyone in the room. Anne, did you want to wrap up with a reminder of our next
Oh,
ISO
thanks
chats.
very much. Yeah, and thanks, Aaron. That was fantastic. Just a reminder that the 20th of August, Effie is going to be talking to you about transformative events, and she'll be using research from her PhD and that she's about to publish as well. So come along to that. It's going to be fantastic. And yeah, all the best to all of you who are in various forms of lockdown, whatever your premiers choose to call it. It's not a good time. So we're thinking of you all. So thanks for coming along. Thanks, Tamara, Effie, and Oscar. And thank you very much, Aaron. It's fantastic.
Thank you.